The last group of surviving German prisoners of war was released in 1956, over 11 years after the war ended. But they were the few lucky ones, if you could call them that, because around 1 million German soldiers who surrendered to the Soviet Red Army wouldn't live to see their homeland again. However, the darkest of all was the fate of those who surrendered after the Battle of Stalingrad, where only 5,000 out of 91,000 would eventually return home, after living for over a decade through horrors unimaginable to ordinary men. This is their story, and it's not for the light guts. So, to understand why such a horrible war of annihilation was fought on the Eastern Front, considered by many as absolutely the worst front of World War II, we have to take a look at how it all began. Keep in mind that just on this front alone, between 30 and 40 million people died, and the whole process could be summed up in 2 words: revenge and retribution. And you'll understand this in a bit. As you probably already know, in the summer of 1941, the German Wehrmacht launched Operation Barbarossa, an enormous invasion of the Soviet Union with over 3 million troops and thousands of tanks and planes. The initial weeks of the operation saw the well-rehearsed German blitzkrieg just decimating the Soviet Red Army, which was anything but prepared for such a ferocious and coordinated attack. The Soviets suffered horrendous casualties, both soldiers and civilians. Hundreds of thousands were taken prisoner, vast territory was lost, and cities and villages fell like dominoes. The German machine just seemed unstoppable, and collapse of the Soviet Union and total victory was expected in weeks. And everything looked like this would be true until the Soviets pulled out an Uno reverse. Okay, it wasn't as simple and easy as that. They scrambled with everything they had to find a way to stop the German onslaught. But now, a couple of things fell into place that did not favor the Germans anymore. The first thing is that they were so far from their homeland and supplies because of how huge and remote the Soviet Union was. So keeping such a huge army alive was a challenge in itself. By late 1941, the advance had bogged down, and everything was made worse by a winter colder than had been seen in decades. This would only be made worse when Hitler shifted south toward the oil fields in the Caucasus, which in theory wasn't a bad idea, but it would eventually be the reason why the whole German army died in Stalingrad. To Hitler's frustration, the operation didn't deliver the quick, decisive blow that he had hoped for. So instead of renewing the drive on Moscow, he split Army Group South and set one wing toward the Volga River at Stalingrad. Okay, so before going into Stalingrad and its prisoners of war, we have to tell you first how this war descended into an ideological war of annihilation. You see, the Eastern Front was not like most of the other fronts in World War II, and for a couple of reasons. German superior race ideology looked upon the Soviet people as subhuman. And it wasn't rare for Red Army soldiers who surrendered to be shot on the spot, or marched off to camps where they were starved or worked to death. Germans, struggling with supplies, weren't too happy to share their already thin rations with prisoners, and there were more than a few instances of Soviet POWs being kept inside barbed wire without food or water until no one was left alive. People who witnessed this said that for arm's length around the wire there wasn't grass, as prisoners ate anything they could find. Another thing that infuriated the Germans were partisans, who were quite effective in disrupting their supply lines stretched across wide, remote regions that simply couldn't be protected. Partisans would either hide in forests or merge with the local population, essentially becoming a guerrilla force, and the Germans didn't like this. They committed many atrocities in villages suspected of supporting partisans or refusing to turn them over. There are many instances of people being gathered in churches, then those churches set on fire, and many other things we can't even mention here on YouTube without the video being taken down. You can find those things for yourself on Google later, if you really want to know. So, these things of course only fueled the hatred between Soviets and Germans, and the front spiraled into a war of total destruction with little to no quote-unquote rules. And Soviet revenge and retribution when the tide of the war turned was, if not justified, at least understandable. Just imagine that most of your family and friends suffered so much because of someone, and now it was your turn to bring suffering to them. Well, that's something like what would now happen to the Germans, for the first time and in the biggest degree after Stalingrad. So this brings us to the battle at Stalingrad. While Army Group A went for the Caucasus, Army Group B went for the Volga. Stalingrad was not initially the original goal, but Hitler soon changed his mind, as he was known to do, and ordered that it must be captured and held at any cost. And that cost would be high for the soldiers. By late August 1942, German columns stood on the Don River, while Luftwaffe bombers leveled Stalingrad and sank ferries on the Volga in several days of constant raids, dropping over 1,000 tons of bombs. In just over a week, roughly 40,000 civilians in Stalingrad died in the destruction, as Stalin kept a big proportion of the population inside to help with the resistance, dig trenches, and prepare fortifications. Around 400,000 civilians were trapped in the ruins. He also issued the infamous Order 227, the no-step-back policy, which made any unauthorized retreat by Red Army soldiers punishable by death. There were even so-called blocking detachments introduced that had the task of firing on any retreating friendly units, making the only possibility of survival, slim as it was, to go forward. The battle for the city opened with a German blow meant to shatter everything at once. After days of heavy bombing, German assault groups with panzers pushed into the city. Their first goal was to reach the Volga and cut the city in two. On the other side was General Vasily Chuikov, who had just been tasked with commanding the city's defense at all costs. He ordered his men to quote-unquote hug the enemy, meaning to stay so close that German air and artillery strikes would always risk hitting their own troops. The bombardment had turned Stalingrad into a field of ruins and made tank maneuver almost impossible. Panzers were picked off at short range by grenades, mines, Molotovs, and anti-tank rifles. Infantry had to lead every step, and combat settled into disturbing door-to-door and room-to-room brawls. You could have a German squad in one building on the second floor, a Soviet team in the basement, and another Soviet group in the attic, all in the same ruined house. Soviet troops used cellars and sewer tunnels as covered routes. They moved in small groups of 5 to 10 men and decimated Germans in surprise attacks from all directions. Their losses were nothing less, as the battle was literally complete carnage. At this range, the most useful weapons were submachine guns, pistols, and grenades, usually ending with shovels and bayonets. Snipers, mines, and booby traps took out everything that moved throughout the ruined city, from soldiers on both sides to civilians trapped in crossfire. The Germans called this kind of fighting rat war, and that is perhaps the best description of it. German pressure almost cracked the defense. Their assault groups had pushed to the Volga in several places and split the Soviet positions, but the Red Army still clung to a narrow strip along the river. Perhaps only a tenth of the city, but they were still there. At the same time, the Germans were near the end of their strength inside the ruins. Ammunition was tight, the cold was creeping in, and they were equipped for summer. While they were in the meat grinder inside the city, far out on the open steppe, their flanks were held by Allied Romanian armies. They were nowhere near as trained and equipped as German units, and they were stretched thin over vast distances with only a limited number of anti-tank weapons. What do you think the Soviets were about to do? They massed about 1.1 million men, more than 800 tanks, and to hide the buildup of such force, they ran false radio traffic, moved units at night, and even built dummy bridges to mislead aerial scouts. Now everything was set without the Germans noticing a thing, and at dawn on November 19, 1942, the Soviets attacked with massive force in two directions. T-34s rolled through positions that had almost no effective anti-tank guns to stop them, and by nightfall, the Soviets had broken wide holes in Romanian lines and captured around 27,000 soldiers in a single day. Within the next few days, the two Soviet spearheads met roughly 60 kilometers west of Stalingrad. The encirclement was complete. Inside the ring were the bulk of 6th Army and attached units, in all roughly 250,000 to 300,000 Axis troops, now cut off from fuel, food, and the rest of Army Group B. General Friedrich Paulus, inside Stalingrad, urgently asked for permission to break out while they still had fuel for tanks, and while the noose was still not airtight. However, Hitler explicitly forbade any retreat and ordered the army to hold the city at all costs. That decision froze the front in place at the moment when movement still might have saved the encircled men. Winter was now closing in, and the Soviets were tightening the noose. Hitler himself promised that the Luftwaffe would keep the army alive solely through air supply. On paper, the 6th Army needed about 700 tons of supplies every day, and that meant everything from food to fuel, ammunition, and medical supplies. But look at this. Already from the beginning of the siege, in reality, the transports managed to deliver only a fraction of that, about 85 tons daily on average, and most of it was fuel and ammo. It wasn't long before the Germans spiraled down into the darkest state known to man. But they didn't even know that this was only the beginning, and the worst was still yet to come. Hunger and cold were soon taking as many lives as the combat itself, which wasn't winding down at all, but quite the contrary. Bodies couldn't be buried as the ground was frozen solid. Disease spread fast. Dysentery and typhus combined with frostbite and gangrene. The ration line shrank to crumbs of frozen bread and scraps of horse meat boiled in dirty water. We won't describe it here, but there were more than a few accounts of eating what there was the most of after fierce combat, and we'll let your imagination do the rest. Ammunition was rationed to the ounce. one anti-tank gun crew might get a single round for the day, with orders to fire only when the hit was certain. The airlift itself was bleeding out. A Soviet tank division struck the key airbase and overran it, and deliveries, already too small, fell even lower. Outside the ring, however, there was hope, at least for a while. On December 12th, the Germans launched Operation Winter Storm to try to break out the encircled army. 4th Panzer Army, with Romanian units in support, drove toward the city and fought its way to within about 30 miles of the pocket. Men inside could hear the distant thunder of artillery, giving them a much-needed hope in an increasingly deteriorating situation. Field Marshal Manstein even pressed General Paulus privately to go against Hitler's orders and attempt to break through from the other side so they could together break the encirclement and save them, but Paulus didn't dare to disobey the Führer. At least, not yet. This was their last gamble, and they didn't even play the hand. The Soviet ring was reinforced from both inward and outward, and the rescue force was relentlessly counterattacked by the Soviets, who knew exactly what they were trying to do. Very soon, it was all over, as the only force that could save them was beaten back. They were completely on their own inside. Very soon, discipline collapsed. Officers shot their own men for disobeying orders or attempting to surrender. Paulus himself began to show the strain, finally realizing that Stalingrad would be their cemetery. Many soldiers were taking the quote-unquote easy way out, realizing this was the end, if you know what I mean. By late January 1943, the army inside the city had split into several small pockets. There were no airstrips left, and supply drops came blind at night, with more of them picked up by Soviet troops. Some groups formed, determined to attempt breaking out on foot, but then they looked at the hundreds of miles of nothing but snow-covered steppe between them and the German lines. The few who actually tried never returned. On January 30th, Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, giving him a subtle hint that no German Field Marshal was ever taken prisoner, basically saying openly to him that death was his destiny. But finally, perhaps when his own ass was on the line, Paulus chose not to listen to Hitler, as he should probably have done much earlier. On January 31st, Soviet troops closed in, and he told all his remaining men that it was enough and ordered them to surrender. The next day, the last pockets of defenders stopped firing, and more than 90,000 men, exhausted and barely clinging to life, laid down their weapons. And yet, believe it or not, this was still not the worst part of their story, and something that is almost never talked about, since winners write the history. The real horrors, and the answer to the title of this video, would now really begin, as if all this before was nothing. Soviets were ordered to clear and secure the city as quickly as possible, so any walking prisoners were marched for several days, sometimes over 50 miles to the rear, through the deep snow and temperatures well below -20 degrees. Germans were still in their summer uniforms, improvising their clothing and boots with anything they could find in the shattered city. Anyone who couldn't keep up with the march was either shot on the spot or simply left to lie in the snow, as either way, he couldn't run anywhere. Food, if at all, came at random and in crude form, a piece of frozen bread or thin soup occasionally. Just days after capitulation, out of 91,000 German soldiers, only about 35,000 reached the prison camps alive. They were moved from camp to camp, either on foot or by trains, which was equally deadly for the prisoners. They were crammed into cattle wagons, where literally half of them died on the longer journeys. Those who reached the prison camps alive were then sorted by rank and usefulness. Senior officers with propaganda value were separated for special treatment. Doctors and engineers were set aside for their skills, and the mass of ordinary soldiers were organized into labor drafts. But still, this was far from the end of their agony, because now they had to rebuild the very country they had destroyed, as the Soviets put it. They were now sent to work in coal mines, build railways, clear the ruins of cities, and so on. They were at the very bottom of food supplies in the Soviet Union, where even their own people suffered from hunger. So even if someone wanted to give them better conditions, they couldn't. German soldiers were literally worked to death, dying from exhaustion and diseases spread through filthy and overcrowded camps. German doctors tried to do what they could with the little medical equipment they had, but most of the time it came down to vodka for both disinfection and pain relief. Remember also that many of those who surrendered were already wounded in combat, but by this point, almost all of them were dead. Less than half of those sent to camps would survive them. Now, the war finally ended in May 1945 with Germany's unconditional surrender, and you may think this would also mean the prisoners would be released. Well, no. When the war ended, there were still around 2 million German prisoners across the Soviet Union, and they were still subjected to that reparations policy, where they were obligated to rebuild the country they had destroyed, and only then could they go home. Some camps were released months or years after the war, once they completed the project they were working on. For example, when they finished the bridge they were building, they were released home. But this didn't mean everyone would get that privilege. Families of German soldiers back home didn't have any idea what had happened to them, whether they were alive or not, because the Soviets carried almost no records, only approximate numbers of people with no names. For years, they hoped that one day their loved ones would arrive. Prisoners were released gradually through the first 3 years after the war, but this was only a fraction of them. The International Red Cross pressed the Soviets, but despite all efforts, there were still an estimated 85,000 German prisoners who had not been released. It wasn't until after Stalin's death in 1953, when the political climate shifted and the West tried to press harder for the release of surviving soldiers, that things changed. Listen to this. In October 1955, a full 11 years after the war had ended, the last 10 to 15,000 men were finally released and delivered home by train. They were barely recognizable, some still wearing the remnants of their uniforms. These were the scenes of reunions with families who had known nothing about them for years. Their own children didn't recognize them, and their houses no longer existed. The men who returned home were not the husbands and fathers who had left. They were someone else now, destroyed for life by what they had survived against unbelievable odds. Out of over 90,000 men from Stalingrad, about 5,000 would return home alive from the war they had marched into 15 years earlier.